Are the Australian government trying to take our freedom of speech away? Let's have a look at what they are doing. The Australian Labor Party have drafted a legislation that they say is to combat seriously harmful misinformation and disinformation. The trouble with this bill is that it will threaten the freedom of speech of all Australians, as the government are exempt from being censored. Sky News Australia and Fox News have called this proposed bill an attack on our freedoms.
No one has a monopoly on truth.
They can't point to anything other than contested argument. Here's their definition of misinformation. If you disagree with me, that's misinformation.
And it's an extremely anti-democratic way of viewing the world, and it's coming from the people who see themselves as the defenders of democracy. And so there is this new kind of elitist guardianship. The best counter to disinformation is free speech.
The Institute of Public Affairs highlighted 3 fundamental flaws in this bill, which are: 1. A revised definition of misinformation to mean content that is verifiable as false, misleading or deceptive would create legal powers for politically biased fact-checkers to determine what is true and false. 2. It creates an unelected and unaccountable star chamber bureaucracy with the power to launch investigations and hearings to ensure compliance with censorship guidelines that can target mainstream Australians. 3. A new definition of serious harm is even broader than the first bill and can potentially capture any difference of opinion. The first revision of this bill failed last year during the Voice referendum, where it was proven that the fact-checkers targeted people voting no and censored them. Previous research by the Institute of Public Affairs found that fact-checking organisations were systematically biased and targeted the No campaign in the Voice to Parliament referendum. The biggest problem with the government's proposed communications legislation amendment, Combating Misinformation and Disinformation, bill is that it will not be a balanced approach and it will affect our freedom of expression and opinion. This bill will give Australian Communications and Media Authority more power to combat misinformation and disinformation, which will not find a balance between censorship and objectively false content and protection of the freedom of expression. The Australian Human Rights Commission has highlighted 4 main concerns about the bill. The first issue is the overly broad and vague way key terms, such as misinformation, disinformation, and harm, are defined. Laws targeting misinformation and disinformation require clear and precise definitions. Drawing a clear line between truth and falsehood is not a simple task. The broad term the government have used will risk making unpopular controversial opinion or beliefs to be subjectively labelled as misinformation or disinformation, creating censorship as a result. The second key problem is how the low harm threshold established by the proposed law. Content that is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm is at risk of being labelled as misinformation or disinformation. The categories of harm are extremely broad, including things like harm to the health of Australians and harm to the Australian environment. Most people have very diverse views about what constitutes as harm under these categories. The definitions provide no guidance about how harm is meant to be judged. The proposed law does not define what is classified as serious harm. Content can be labelled as misinformation even if it does not actually cause harm, it only has to be likely to do so. Even further, the harm threshold is not limited to causation but requires only contribution, and no minimum level of contribution is stated. This leaves even a minor unrelated contribution will be sufficient. The hard threshold under this bill is extremely low and risks allowing a huge broad range of content to be potentially restricted. The third concern highlighted by the Commission is the way the proposed law defines excluded content, which is content that is protected from being labelled as misinformation or disinformation. An example of this is that the drafted bill defines any content that is authorised by the government as being excluded content. This means the government information cannot, by definition, be misinformation or disinformation under law. This is dictatorship. This does not acknowledge the reality that misinformation and disinformation can come from the government. Indeed, the government misinformation and disinformation raises particular concerns given the enhanced legitimacy and authority that many people attach to information received from official government sources. This specific exclusion privileges government content but fails to accord the same status to content authorized by the opposition, minor parties, or independents. The result is that the government content can never be misinformation, but content critical of the government produced by political opponents might be. Any law censoring online information to counter misinformation and disinformation is meant to be impartial and apolitical. The fourth concern relates to the powers to regulate digital content that are granted under the draft bill to digital platform providers and ACMA. There are inherent dangers in allowing any one body to determine what is and is not censored content. This can and probably will restrict the public debate and censor unpopular opinions. This is a way of censoring people and removing the right to have an opinion, whether it be a popular opinion or not. The Australian Labor Party have drafted a legislation that they say is to combat seriously harmful misinformation and disinformation. The trouble with this bill is that it will threaten the freedom of speech of all Australians, as the government are exempt from being censored. My personal opinion is that this is an attack on the freedom of all Australians. It is scary to think that the Australian government are trying to push this country into dictatorship by stripping our rights one by one. The government have stopped listening to the voters of this country and are now treating all citizens like children. I'm not sure what we can do about it. As Australians, we need to let the government know this is not what we want and that they are destroying all out civil rights and freedoms. Thanks for watching. If you like the content, please hit like, subscribe and follow to keep up to date with new videos.
The federal government tried to censor the footage from the internet. Julie Inman-Grant ordered social media companies to take down footage of the knife attack from their platforms, not just in Australia, but globally. Inman-Grant went so far as to take X to court because it wouldn't censor the footage to her satisfaction. Remember, the content has been and will continue to be blocked for Australian users. Inman-Grant's demands for global censorship have been denied, at least for now. The Prime Minister also weighed into the debate by saying, quote, "Surely there is now a recognition that misinformation is a problem on social media." The comments by the Prime Minister are both wrong and concerning. Misinformation laws are about allegedly false information, yet the footage of the knife attacks was not in fact false or misleading.